It's around 155 AD. A very old man, 86 years old, is eating dinner. Soldiers surround his house. His friends are begging him to run, to hide. And you know what this man does? He feeds the soldiers who came to arrest him. He asks them for an hour to pray, and then he walks out voluntarily. They bring him into a stadium packed with people screaming for his blood. The Roman governor leans forward and makes him the easiest offer in the world. Just say Caesar is Lord, that's all. 2 words, you walk free. And this old man, this 86-year-old bishop, looks at that crowd, looks at that governor, and says, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? They lit the fire, and eyewitnesses said the fire formed an arch around him, like a sail catching wind. They said the smell wasn't burning flesh, it smelled like baking bread, like incense. They eventually had to send in a soldier with a dagger to finish the job. That man's name was Polycarp. And here's the wild part. And this is what Ken Johnson says we've completely missed. Polycarp wasn't just brave. Polycarp was carrying a secret. Not the kind of secret you hide because it's shameful. The kind you protect because the whole world is trying to destroy it. Today, we're going into that secret. Stick with me. YouTube demonetized my channel. This means I make 0 from these videos. To those who came to my rescue on my last video and contributed, thank you so much and may God bless you. If you are feeling blessed and you love the work I do here, you can tip my work on the link attached in the description or on the pinned comments. And before some of you run to the comments breathing fire with "get a job" comments, this is my job. And if you love Ken Johnson, welcome home. This is the place where we sit down and go through all of his work. Not to argue, not to discredit, but to understand. I'll say this up front. I'm not a theologian. I'm not Ken Johnson. If I get something wrong in this video, that's on my interpretation, not his. Ken's YouTube channel is linked in the description. His books are in the description. If you want the primary source, go get the books. I'll leave the links below. This video is a starting point, not a replacement. Okay, now let's go deep. So most people who've heard of Polycarp know maybe one thing about him, that he died for his faith. Full stop. And they move on. But Ken Johnson spends serious time on Polycarp because Polycarp isn't just a martyr story. Polycarp is a link in a chain, and it's a chain that most of modern Christianity has completely severed. Here's the setup. The Apostle John, the one who wrote the Gospel of John, the book of Revelation, the letters, John was the last surviving apostle. He lived into old age in Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And during those final decades, he had students, young men he personally discipled. He poured everything into them, not just Bible knowledge, his knowledge, things Jesus said in private, how to read prophecy, what the Messiah actually meant by certain things. Polycarp was one of those students. And that right there is what Ken Johnson calls a direct chain of custody. Think about it like this. If you wanted to know exactly what a lawyer meant in a contract, the best person to ask isn't the professor who studied it 200 years later. The best person is the one who sat in the room and watched the lawyer write it. Polycarp sat in the room. He heard John teach. He saw John's face when he talked about what he'd witnessed. Irenaeus, who is another massive figure in all of this, wrote a letter where he described sitting at Polycarp's feet as a young man. And he said something incredible. He said he remembered the exact seat Polycarp sat in when he preached. He remembered his voice, his manner, the stories he told about John and the other apostles. Irenaeus says he soaked those up like water on dry ground because he understood that Polycarp was a living connection to the source. That chain, Jesus, apostles, Polycarp, Irenaeus, that's the line Ken Johnson keeps coming back to over and over. Because here's the question that drives his entire research project. What if the church forgot things? Not because of some dramatic conspiracy, but just forgot. Like how your grandparents' generation knew skills that simply weren't passed down? And when you go back to these early writings, you find that the answer is yes, a lot was forgotten. Some things were changed on purpose, and Polycarp in particular tried to warn the church that it was happening. So here's one of the most fascinating details Ken Johnson brings out. And I want to be clear, this comes from historical records that are well documented, not speculation. Polycarp traveled to Rome at some point to meet with a bishop there named Anicetus. They disagreed on something, specifically the date of Passover and how it connected to Christian practice. They talked, they didn't reach agreement, and they parted in peace. That part is well known. But something else happened in Rome that tells you everything about who Polycarp was. He crossed paths with a man named Marcion. Now, Marcion was one of the most influential heretics in early church history. His basic idea? The God of the Old Testament was a completely different God than the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament was harsh, violent, tribal. The New Testament God was love and grace. Jesus came to free people from the Old Testament God, not to fulfill it. Sound familiar? A version of this idea still floats around today. Polycarp had zero patience for it. When Marcion saw him in Rome and said, essentially trying to get some kind of recognition, "Do you not know me, Polycarp?" Polycarp looked at him and said, "Yes, I know you. You are the firstborn of Satan." Now, that seems harsh by modern standards, but here's what Ken Johnson draws your attention to. Polycarp didn't say that because he was mean. He said it because he had personally received from John, who received from Jesus, that this exact kind of teaching was going to come and destroy the church from within. And Polycarp felt the weight of that responsibility every single day. He wasn't protecting an institution. He was protecting knowledge, specific, irreplaceable first-hand knowledge. And when people try to alter it, whether through Gnosticism or Marcionism or any of the other isms popping up in the 2nd century, Polycarp hit back hard. Not with violence, with clarity. This is one of the core arguments in Ken Johnson's work in Ancient Church Fathers. The very fact that people like Polycarp had to fight this hard against heresies tells you that those heresies were aggressively spreading. It wasn't a few fringe weirdos in someone's basement. These were organized movements with charismatic leaders who were pulling entire congregations away from what the apostles had taught. And here's the dark twist. Stick with me here, because this is the part that most people gloss over. Some of those heresies won. Not immediately, not obviously. But over centuries, teachings that Polycarp would have called demonic became standard church doctrine. Ken Johnson documents this in a way that's genuinely uncomfortable, chapter by chapter, showing you the exact moment where a doctrine shifted, who shifted it, and what argument they used. But before we get to what was lost, I want to tell you about the document that started to unlock all of this. And it's a document that almost nobody reads. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night about this whole topic. Irenaeus, Polycarp's star student, wrote something in Against Heresies that scholars have been arguing about for 200 years. He kept referring to an unnamed apostolic presbyter, basically an elder from the apostolic generation, and attributed some very specific, very detailed teachings about the end times to this person. For a long time, nobody knew who this mysterious presbyter was. And then a scholar named Charles E. Hill, and Ken Johnson engages with this heavily, made an argument that this whole time the presbyter Irenaeus kept quoting was Polycarp himself, that these were Polycarp's private teachings. The things he said when writing and preaching weren't in his surviving letter. They were transmitted through Irenaeus, almost like footnotes hidden in someone else's book, which means Polycarp's real teaching is still out there, just scattered. Just buried in other people's writings. So what did those teachings say? Hold on, because to understand the answer, we need to understand the world these men were living in. And when you understand the pressure they were under, what they chose to preserve starts to make a lot more sense.
Ken Johnson's argument, drawn from reading these church fathers in their own words, is that the early church held a very specific, very detailed eschatology, end times theology. And it wasn't vague, it wasn't symbolic, it was a timeline. Let me give you the highlights, because this is where it gets wild. According to Ken Johnson's research, the disciples of the apostles, including people in Polycarp's circle, believed that the second coming of Christ would be approximately 2,000 years after the first coming. The first coming they dated to around 32 AD. Add 2,000 years, you get approximately 2032. Ken Johnson himself is careful to say he's not setting a date for the end of the world, but he points out that this calculation came from Irenaeus, from Hippolytus, from 2nd century men who got it directly from people who sat with the apostles. This wasn't speculation, this was a teaching passed down. And connected to that timeline was a very specific understanding of what the church would experience before Christ returned. Here's where Ken Johnson gets into the rapture debate. And look, I know this is a hot topic. I'm not here to tell you who's right, but what Ken Johnson says is this. The pre-tribulational rapture, the idea that Christians are taken out before the worst of the end times hits, was not invented by a guy named John Nelson Darby in the 1800s, as many critics claim. He says it was taught by Irenaeus, who got it from the generation before him, who got it from the apostles. The specific passage in Irenaeus that Ken Johnson points to is in Against Heresies, Book 5. Irenaeus writes about the church being suddenly caught up before a time of tribulation that will be unlike anything that's ever happened before. Now, and I'll be transparent here, other scholars dispute this interpretation. They say Irenaeus was talking about something different. They say the early church expected to go through tribulation, not be taken out before it. Both sides have serious people making serious arguments. What makes Ken Johnson's contribution valuable, whatever you land on theologically, is that he's forcing you to go back to the original sources. He's not just making claims, he's pointing you to the texts. He's saying, read this yourself. And that is actually what Polycarp was asking the church to do all along. So Polycarp's one surviving piece of writing is his letter to the church at Philippi. And here's what's interesting. It's not a long theological treatise. It's a pastoral letter. He's writing to a congregation dealing with very ordinary problems. Some leaders were caught stealing from the church fund, people were getting spiritually lazy, some were following false teachers. And Polycarp's response is not to write a new theology. His response is, go back to what you were taught. He quotes Paul constantly. He references Matthew. He cites the letters of Peter. Almost everything he writes is, as the apostles said, as the Lord commanded, as it was handed down to us. Ken Johnson sees this as extremely significant because in an age when all kinds of new teachings were flooding the church, Gnostic gospels, mystery cult theology, Platonic philosophy being mixed into Christianity, Polycarp's whole game was to hold the line. His letter is essentially a warning dressed up as encouragement. He tells the Philippians to be zealous in pursuing what is good. He warns them to keep away from false brethren and from those who carry the name of the Lord but lead people into error. He tells them to flee the love of money, specifically because the church leader who'd been stealing was a deacon named Valens, and Polycarp's handling of that situation is actually a masterclass in church discipline. He doesn't throw the man out, he says pray for him, he says restore him, but he makes clear the behavior cannot continue. What this tells us, and again, this is the lens Ken Johnson brings to it, is that the early church, the people trained by the apostles, had a completely different relationship to death than we do. Not in a morbid way, but think about this. The way Polycarp walked to his death, the way he fed the soldiers, the way he refused the nails because he said God would give him the strength to stand still, that wasn't performance, that wasn't bravado. That was a man who genuinely believed, with absolute certainty, that he knew where he was going and that it was better.
Irenaeus records that Polycarp used to say, "I marvel that you don't all want to die, not because life is bad, but because what comes next is so good." And that theology, that total fearlessness in the face of death, it came from Polycarp's direct conversations with John, who told him what he'd seen on Patmos, who told him what Jesus had said about what awaits the faithful. We'll come back to this, because there's a specific teaching here that Ken Johnson ties to the book of Revelation in a way you probably haven't heard before, and it changes the way you read the whole thing. Stay with me just a little longer. So let me try to pull this all together, because by now you might be asking, okay, so things got changed, but what specifically? What exactly did we lose? Ken Johnson, across several books, builds a list, and some of it is what you'd expect. Debates about baptism, about the nature of Christ, about church structure. But some of it is genuinely surprising. Here's one. The early church was pro-Israel in a way that's radical by any era standards. Irenaeus, who got this from Polycarp, who got it from John, taught that the literal nation of Israel had a central role in end times prophecy. The land promises in the Old Testament were literal. Jerusalem was going to be literally rebuilt and restored, and the church was not a replacement for Israel, it was a partner with Israel in God's plan. This is what scholars call premillennialism, and Ken Johnson argues it was the universal teaching of the early church, the men who learned from the apostles. The shift happened later, when theologians from a more Greek philosophical background started treating the Old Testament prophecies as allegory rather than literal prediction. Here's another one. The early church had no doctrine of purgatory. Death was not a waiting room where you did more time to pay for sins. You either knew Christ or you didn't. This shifted gradually over centuries, and by the medieval period, it had become one of the most financially significant doctrines the church had, because people would pay enormous amounts of money to buy prayers for their dead relatives. Polycarp would have had words for that. And here's one that doesn't get enough attention. The early church regarded certain books outside the Bible as historically valuable and spiritually serious. Books like the Book of Jasher, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas. Not as equal to Scripture, that's an important distinction, but as windows into the period and as documents that preserved genuine traditions. Ken Johnson does a lot of work on how these texts illuminate the biblical text, and Polycarp's own letter to the Philippians quoted from many of these widely circulated early Christian writings, as though everyone knew them. When the canon was being formalized, some of these got cut, others were quietly shelved, and the knowledge they contained, the context they provided, went with them. This is what Ken Johnson keeps trying to recover, not to add to the Bible, not to replace what's there, but to read the Bible the way the first century church read it, with all the background knowledge they had that we've lost. Let's go back to that stadium in Smyrna. Polycarp knew it was coming. The night before, he had a vision, and in that vision, he saw his pillow catch fire. He woke up and told the people around him, "I must be burned alive." He wasn't afraid. This is the part that messes with people's heads. When they brought him to the stadium, the proconsul pleaded with him, genuinely seemed to not want to kill this old man. He said, "Just respect your age, swear by Caesar, say away with the atheists, and you go free." And here's a detail that almost never gets told. Polycarp looked at the crowd of pagans around the stadium, gestured at them, and said, "Away with the atheists." He was calling the idol worshippers the atheists, not the Christians, because from his understanding, trained by John, trained by the apostles, the Romans were the ones worshiping things that didn't exist, and he was not going to pretend otherwise, not for 1 second, not even to save his life. After the fire formed that inexplicable arch around him, after the eyewitnesses described the smell of bread and incense, after the soldier's dagger finally ended it, the church at Smyrna wrote a letter to other congregations to tell them what happened. It became the earliest surviving record of a Christian martyrdom outside the book of Acts, and they wrote it as a testimony, not as grief, as celebration. Ken Johnson's point here is profound. The early church's theology about suffering was radically different from ours. They didn't believe God promised them comfort. They believed God promised them presence. That's a different religion almost in practical terms, and Polycarp carried it to the end. So let me bring this home. What Ken Johnson is doing, and what makes his work so worth studying, is holding up a mirror to the modern church and saying, look at the original. Compare. You don't have to agree with every conclusion he reaches. As I said at the start of this video, I'm working from my own reading and my own translations of his work. If anything I said tonight is off, that's on me, not Ken. Go to his channel. Go to his books. The links are below. The ancient church fathers is probably the best starting point. The rapture is where his end times theology gets really detailed. And his own YouTube channel, linked below, has hours of teaching that goes further than I can in a single video. If this blessed you, help me create more videos by tipping in the description. Seriously, I'm not monetized. Your support is what makes the next video possible. Subscribe if you're new. Come back for the next one. We're just getting started.